So my name is Susan Lord, and I'm a guest editor for the Journal of Family Therapy doing a special edition on trauma and systemic work. And I am here in my home in York, Maine, because of the COVID virus, speaking with Vikki Reynolds in Vancouver, British Columbia. And Vikki has been wonderfully generous in writing an article for the journal called Trauma and Resistance, Hang Time and Other Innovative Responses to Oppression, Violence, and Suffering. And I just wanted to start out by asking Vikki to tell us a little bit about herself.
Thanks. Well, Susan, thanks for doing this, and thanks for inviting me to write that article. So I'm a social justice activist and a therapist, a clinical supervisor. I'm an adjunct professor, and I've done clinical supervision at the Center for Survivors of Torture. With the Downtown East Side, that's the poorest part of Canada that's off First Nations Reserve. It's the heart, right now for us, it's the heart of the opioid catastrophe. I've been responding to that catastrophe for the last 5 years. It's interesting because this pandemic has just landed on top of the opioid catastrophe and totally annihilated it from people's vision, as well as that's happening on Indigenous territory of genocide, and that's gotten erased. So I'm trying to respond to all of those kind of things. I supervise at a place called Peak House. It's a live-in program for youth, and that's where I get my hope sustained. I work a lot with overdose prevention workers, people in the overdose, the OPS, overdose prevention sites. I've clinically supervised at the Center for Rape Crisis here with WAVA, Women Against Violence Against Women. And I had to leave that work at one point because that feminism wasn't inclusive of trans folks and non-binary people, and also wasn't respectful of sex workers. And then WAVA did their work and wrote apologies to the sex worker community and to the non-binary trans community. And I've worked, so I'm back there working more as an activist now, or just in solidarity work with them. And I've also been the clinical supervisor at the Center for the Trans and Non-Binary Free Clinic that we created. I was there for about 7 years and helped set it up. Everybody there was doing it all just activism, no pay. Most folks there were non-binary and queer, and I'm a white settler with heterosexual and gender privilege. Cisgender privilege. My folks are from Ireland and Newfoundland and England. Yeah, my work has really been, about trying to bridge the worlds of social justice activism and bring that politics and ethics, bridging that into the stuff that gets called therapy or psychology or social work or the helping profession. So that's kind of most of what I do. Yeah.
Great. So I'm really very impressed, and I kind of want to know, how do you come to this work, and how do you sustain yourself in this work?
Well, I came to this work. I mean, I really love Bell Hooks wrote once about that. She came to theory through pain. Yep. Things had to make sense. So I think as an activist, you know, I was working I was living in California when they brought the death penalty back in 1989. And so I got involved in the death penalty struggle. And I'd always been an activist doing other things. But at that time, the idea that the state of California was going to start to kill people who were imprisoned. And I knew which people were going to get killed. No one rich has ever been on death row. And all of these folks had been really abused and abandoned as children and left to their own devices and harmed. And then later when they do something wrong, we're going to take them in a room and kill them. It didn't make any sense to me that a democracy or any country could be trusted to kill their own citizens. It just, I had to do something about that. So that's, I wasn't a therapist then, but working with guys on death row, I worked for over 20 guys on death row. All of them were executed. And those guys taught me that everybody is so much more than the worst thing they've ever done. That's an adage from death penalty work. Everybody is so much more than the worst thing they've ever done. One of the pictures I have up on my wall is for Roger Coleman, who was executed even though he was innocent. They proved he was innocent, and they had a 21-day rule in Virginia. You have 21 days after you have a death sentence, you have to prove you're innocent. So of course, all this evidence came out later that he was innocent. And they actually went to the Supreme Court and won a decision called the right to execute the innocent. And they killed Roger. And his quote says, "A battle has been lost, but the war goes on. Don't give up hope. Never, never quit fighting. This insanity called the death penalty will end someday. Stay strong and keep the faith." And it's got a bloody hand on it. And some folks come to my office and they go, that's kind of harsh, that's really, and I'm like, you know what? I'm still alive and Roger's dead. And I will not abandon him on this side of life. And I didn't give up on him to the last minute that he was alive. We were calling the governor saying stuff like, "There's a man in the room. Someone's going to kill him. You can stop this." And they're like, "Oh my God, are you still phoning us? Why are you doing that?" And I'm like, I'm still calling because I'm still hoping, because I'm still human, and I am hoping to get a human being on the end of the line. And it's interesting because all of the work I've done with, survivors of torture, rape, political violence, the opiate catastrophe, all of this, people really worry about why don't I burn out? And the thing is, like Roger, keeping Roger alive in my life, it actually really feeds my hope. I believed in hope. I think it's an ethical obligation to move towards hope, and so I don't, so I guess one thing I think about is the teachings from all of those men, that they were so much more than the worst thing they've ever done. That's how I was able to work with men who've raped and abused women. That's how I was able to become, a therapist. I always see, those teachings have been invaluable in the work that I do. So I think, I came to this work as an activist because the question I'm always asking in clinical supervision is, what is the best use of me? And that's all I'm trying to respond to, Susan. It's like, in this moment, what is the best use of me? That's why I've been called to the opiate catastrophe over the last couple of years, because I'm well suited to be in there, so it's this fluid, reflexive, ethical question continually, like what's the best use of me? And I was never going to go back to school, and I was never going to get a PhD or be a professor. But just like Bell Hooks said, there's times that activism, what's the best use of me, and what is your role? What have you got to bring to the movement? It made sense for me to try to move these ideas, which you edited and have published in this really important journal. I'm totally humbled to be in there. And the fact that, the JFT would have ideas from social justice activism, centered around a conversation that's medicalized about trauma, that's the best use of me.
That's great. Thank you. So how do you think about trauma? One of the things I struggle with is, I am a therapist and a professor also, I struggle with at what level to intervene, and am I part of the problem or am I part of the solution as I'm working with people? And it seems that you work with larger systems, larger and larger. And so I have located myself working with individuals and families and groups, but I think of it as working from the inside out. And I think you're working from the outside in, if I understand it.
Well, that's kind of cool. I mean, I think oppression, you got to take it on all fronts. I think there's room for us to do liberatory work, on all places. So how I think about trauma, I'm extremely concerned about the word trauma. 20 years ago, we didn't have trauma, right? When I started teaching in a master's program, they brought me in to run a trauma course, the first trauma course, because I was working with survivors of torture. But I said, I'm not going to teach about trauma. I'm going to teach about people's resistance to oppression and violence. They're like, yeah, trauma. My concern about trauma is complicated, but it just starts with as soon as you have a word like trauma, we're taking people's real experiences in the physical world, which is not socially just, which has structural oppression, and we're locating the problem right inside, not just the person's head, but their synapses now, right? And if the problem's in the brain, the solution's in the brain. So then all we need to do is find the right psychopharmacology, and that's going to get them out of it. Well, if the problem is residential schools and genocide and continued racism against Indigenous people, like here in Canada, a couple of weeks ago in the province of Manitoba, 3 Indigenous people were murdered by police within a span of 10 days.
Wow.
That's not trauma, that's state violence. And many Indigenous people would say that's ongoing genocide. As soon as you label that, the whole community's now got collective trauma about this, or multi-generational trauma. Now we're talking about broken Indigenous people as opposed to why are the cops being allowed to kill Indigenous people without an inquiry, right? So as soon as you use the word trauma, we're getting into psychological language and an explanation that conceals a lot more than it reveals. And it leads us down a path that says, oh, now let's find out the criteria, whether or not they match a diagnosis of trauma. Oh, then what's the treatment? Oh, then what's the medication? And so it moves it right into the individual's responsibility for their own harm. And it disappears, you know, the structures of inequity that have really fostered this kind of harm. So trauma is really problematic on many levels, but primarily for me as a social justice activist, it takes something that is inherently, like structurally based on these forms of oppression and turns it into a medical problem of a particular person. Yeah. The second biggest thing that it does, though, is it hides people's resistance. So when I started working with survivors of torture, it never made sense to me as an activist to start to ask people, did they rape you? Did they make you rape other people? Did they make you witness the rape of others? Like all of these things we know happen in all prisons and happen in all political violence situations of torture and political violence. That just wasn't the path I wanted to go down. I think about we have all kinds of measurable outcomes and best practice ideas. Where's the measurable outcome about what happens 8 hours after your conversation with a person? You have a conversation with a person about that quote trauma. Even if you're in John Breer's window and you're doing all of that good stuff, what happens to the person after this session? Because for many of the folks that I work with, that's when you want to blow out your brains. That's when you want to go get high, go get loaded, do something to disconnect from this. So that just, and the other thing is it's such a diminishing conversation about the person. What I always say in work with quote trauma is, I need to know whatever you think I need to know so I can be useful. And I try to resist, especially us having PhDs. I often say having a PhD is like a training in arrogance. Like I've actually been taught that like within 45 minutes of talking to somebody, I can tell whether or not they have a personality disorder or who they are. I know them better than they know themselves, and their loved ones and their networks know them. That's a lot of power, especially when you know, our power can have people's children apprehended, like all these kind of things. So I never talked to people about their trauma. I asked people about their resistance. So I think of this one guy, Bauman, and I've written another article called Poetic Resistance, Bauman's Resistance to Political Violence and Torture. And he was a co-author of that. We published that out of Dulwich in Australia. And when I met him, you know, he was getting all ready to give me this torture story because he'd had to tell, you know, the Red Cross, he had to tell the United Nations, he had to tell the lawyers, he had to tell Canadian refugee people. He'd had to tell this story of here's how destroyed I am, here's how demeaned I was, here's how diminished, and here's my dignity attacks. And so he was getting ready. Oh, it's a psychotherapist. I better get ready to tell her my trauma. And instead I asked him, look at most people who are tortured die. And you're right here. This is amazing. Can you teach me how it is that you're still alive? And he just sat up, and you could go, you know, you could, I'm not a yoga person, I'm not a yoga instructor, but you can hear the spine line up. And I swear he breathed in and parts of his lungs got air that hadn't for like 8 years. And he looked at me and he said, no one has ever asked me that. And then he said, prepare to be amazed. And I was totally amazed, right? And so what I was after was this stories of resistance, because this person is alive. So wherever, you know, wherever there's oppression and violence, there's always a story of resistance. You know, Alan Wade's work and the response-based people, they talk a lot about that. I come to that from an activist perspective. I was like, this person's alive. How did they stay alive under torture? Like, how did you resist this? And so instead of talking about trauma and symptomology and all that other kind of stuff, we talked about these acts of resistance, which is such a different lens. It's an activist lens. And it remembered him to being an activist in his own life. You know, Goffman talks about the fact that people are activists in their own lives. He wrote that in 1961, I think, in asylums. You know, so that's the stream. So it's, you know, it's funny, I ended up here like from activism, but I think what I'm doing is just witnessing as an activist would, you know?
So witnessing, that seems to be a big part of what you do. And I actually I teach your article. And one of the things I love is in the online edition, he's reading his poem, right? In silhouette. It's just beautiful. So witnessing, I think, acts of humanity, acts of kind of creativity, whatever it is that enlivens people, or where do they go to stay alive? Can you say more about witnessing?
Yeah, I think witnessing there's many, many traditions of people using witnessing.
Mm-hmm.
Mukungu Akinyala does a testimony work with Black people, and he talks about the soul wounds. Ken Hardy's ideas about soul wounds, that gets healed through testimony work. I think that's a form of witnessing.
Mm-hmm.
I know Kathy Richardson, um, as an Indigenous woman, uses her Métis culture for witnessing, and Barb out of Dulwich does this from an Aboriginal perspective. For me, it comes from activism, the duty of the witness. So as in social justice activism, um, I'm doing acts of solidarity with other people as a witness. When I'm called in as an activist and I see something, there's a duty of the witness to actually do something, not just to listen to this, but to do something with my own access to privilege,
Mm-hmm.
my own expansive life choices, to
Mm-hmm.
actually change the context in which this harm happens. So I have to be an activist against political violence and torture. I mean that by witnessing, but also witnessing is something very different than therapy. And it's interesting because in that article with Bauman, at the end of our talk about, this guy's an Iranian guy who was tortured for 7 years and, brutally tortured and escaped and all this. And then he found me in Vancouver and we did a lot of witnessing work together. And I was witnessing his acts of resistance. And he says to me one day, really, Susan, we're sitting there early days. And he says to me, did you know that I'm a poet? And I said, did you know my first degree was in canoeing, but my second degree is in poetry. I'm not a poet.
Really?
I read poetry. And,
Yeah.
and then he says to me, well, would it be okay with you if these stories of resistance you're looking for, because he wanted me to know all the torture story. He wanted a witness. And I would bear witness to that. But I said, I'll bear witness to that. But you also need to let me, I want to witness more than just the torture. I also want to witness your acts of resistance to that. So then he says to me, would it be okay if I told you these acts of resistance in poems?
Mm-hmm.
So that's how that came about. And then we had years where he wrote me a poem every week.
Wow.
And it was usually in Farsi, and he would read it in Farsi, and we would try to put it in English together. And our friend Colin Sanders, who was part of those videos, he read the poems in English. He helped Bauman, put them together, because Colin Sanders is actually a poet and I'm not. So they put them together. So we're, that witnessing of that. So he was asking me to witness his poetry. So we were not just witnessing the trauma, we were witnessing the acts of resistance, but the ways that he wanted to be witnessed are very particular and creative and connected for him. And what he said at the end of that, our time together at the end, and it was in the articles, Colin interviewed him about the therapy and how it was. And he said, we didn't do trauma therapy. Vikki was an activist and she was in solidarity with me. He actually mentioned Che Guevara. He said she had a picture of Che Guevara in her office, and I knew, because Che Guevara left his children and he went off to Bolivia and he was killed, and he left 5 kids to the state. A lot of people judge him for that. And this person had left their children as an activist, thinking, and he said, I knew she wasn't going to come from this heteronormative, middle class thing, like, how dare you put your kids at risk? Like, I knew when I saw your picture of Che Guevara that we were going to be in solidarity with each other. And so what Bauman said was, it wasn't really therapy. It was more like 2 activists in solidarity, and she was witnessing me. And he said, if she had done trauma work and just asked me about my torture or my trauma, I wouldn't be okay now. But that's not what we did. Instead, I have these stories of resistance. And then he really decentered me, which was lovely, hearkening back to Michael White's influence to be decentered. And he said the thing that mattered the most was actually the poems and the films that you mentioned that Gwen made. He goes, so now all the families of all my friends who were murdered, I've done something for them and their children, that they can be remembered in these ways. So this witnessing is ongoing, and it's not just, quote, therapists or workers who act as witnesses. We act as witnesses of each other, and there's these broader communities. So when I talk about witnessing, I'm trying to take psychology work and put it back. I've built a bridge from social justice activism over here, trying to take it back and resituate the work inside a context where it's our duty now as the witness to do something to change the context where torture, violence, oppression is happening.
So that sense of community, it sounds like even when you're working with one person, you involve a bigger world. And yeah.
I think we need to resist individuation all the
Yeah.
time, right?
Right.
And so psychology is, like the map of psychology is an individual project, and in particular, one-to-one therapy is something that's extremely problematic on a lot of levels.
Mhm.
One of my biggest critiques about it is class and access and who can do all of this.
Sure.
But the other thing is that, I feel like I know that torture disconnects people and dismembers people from best parts of themselves and their relationships to other, right? It's the total, what the torturers are studying is psychology. They're studying psychosis because what they want to do is create psychosis. And I'm using that term loosely, but I think about the people I've worked with who have, quote, who are in a psychotic state or have psychosis, people in the downtown east side, really poor people exasperated with all these kind of structures. It's like they're crying, help me, I'm drowning. And I'm right there and I'm saying, hey, I'm Vikki, I'm right here, I want to help you. And they're like, Vikki, why aren't you helping me? And that our words can't touch each other. Right? As Lynn Hoffman says, words really touch people. So, this massive disconnection. So what torture is trying to do, what the torturers do, and it's science. I mean, there's a lot of money behind it. And we know in America, right, there were people involved with the APA were involved setting up the torture in Guantanamo Bay. And all of us at the time were saying, you guys are involved in torture. And like, oh no, we can be trusted. We can't be trusted with this.
Right.
So, what people are studying, the torturers are studying, is psychosis, because what they're trying to do to people is break them in particular ways. But the most important thing is disconnection, that they feel entirely isolated, that if you were sitting with me in a room, Susan, and I was screaming, you would abandon me to save yourself. That that's the way you break human beings, is we are meant to be relational. We are relational. And so, therapy that is individual is really problematic, and seeing problems inside people is problematic. So all of this individualism is the stuff we need to take apart. So for me, it's like that collective accountability, collective care, solidarity. That's this stuff that puts people into networked communities of others. This is the stuff, this is the stuff that matters, right? This belonging and connection. I think a lot about an ethic of belonging, like where do people belong with others? And I think this was paramount for me because I'm Irish Catholic and my culture really matters to me. I come from a huge clan. At one point I was at the cottage, and we've got 3 cottages side by each in our family. And there was like 70 people in the water and on the land during one O'Rourke reunion, like one Irish. Yeah. So that's my map of the world.
Yeah.
And when you do that intersectionality from Crenshaw, people look at domains of identity. One of the things on there is family and connection. Like whether you have money, privilege or not, we all had a bunch of people who would die for us and do anything for us. So that's core to me, my own culture, my connected family, my clan. And so that's what I'm trying to, so then I'm working with, Bauman, who also comes from collective communities, because we all do. Capitalism has tried to destroy that, but no one's culture was about individualism, right? That's capitalism, that's patriarchy, that's empire, right? So here's Bauman, an individual, and he doesn't get to speak his language. He doesn't get to hold his children. He doesn't get to have his lover. He doesn't get to eat his food. I mean, how do we, more important than any kind of psychological like how do we situate him within belonging? How do we belong him in community? How do we, what's our ethic and our obligation to tether him to this planet and to each other, right? So that's, and I think that just comes from culture, my culture and my I think my spirituality very much is solidarity. I often say that I feel that because I am a spiritual person, I really am Irish Catholic, but I feel like when I'm on the homelessness march, I feel like I'm in church. Like these are my people, and I don't need to. I know if any enforcement agent is trying to hurt any homeless person, everybody is going to rally around that person, whether we know each other's names or not. That's how I know each other, and that kind of that's what I mean by like connection, belonging, solidarity around these collective ethics.
So my mind is going a million miles an hour, wondering what to. So structuring safety is part of what you talk about in this work, and I guess I keep wondering, it must be an incredible discipline to keep yourself on the edge of this and not kind of fall over onto any side as you're working with people, because there's so many. I think there's so many traps, and
Mm.
I keep wondering. So how do you keep yourself kind of honest and safe and trustworthy? And um, you talk about spirituality, maybe that's part of it. But what is your discipline when you're doing this work?
Well, I think that in terms of structuring safety, that's that we don't, there's nothing else. And
Right.
when I was teaching trauma therapy, and I'm sure this is true in your classes too, with all levels, master's students, PhD students, it's like, okay, Reynolds, you're so into the structuring safety. When do we get the structuring safety out of the way so we can get to the real stuff?
Yeah.
Which is what the saying the uncle attacked you, like getting to the dirt, And for me, structuring safety is the real work. So one of the things, I liked your question. It's a curious, lovely question, because one of the things I try to do is be really cognizant of the fact that the more education you have, the more arrogance you're going to have. When I
Right.
say arrogance, I mean thinking you're right. You're the one with the maps. And
Yeah.
oh man, like certainty. As soon as you get with ideas of, I know this one, I know where to go with this. As soon as you're with certainty and you're starting to plug into any kind of paint by numbers thing, then, there be dragons, right? So how do we stay open to the other? As Berber talked about, I thou, like the sacredness of this person's story, right? And David Epstein talks about who's got the storytelling rights, this person's story. How do I make sure that I don't diminish? They come with this huge story of their life, and then we go after pieces that look like the criteria for a trauma diagnosis, and we leave out this. So in terms of structuring safety, like the things I think about is, I have a bit of a map for that. I think structuring safety is the real work. I think about what's, when I'm at a rape crisis center and I let a woman know, if I ask something that's not okay, how can you let me know that what I've asked isn't all right? And they're like, oh, am I allowed to do that? And everybody said, well, if you don't want to answer it, don't answer it. I spend a lot of time intentionally structuring safety. It's like, what do you know about yourself that lets you know you're going to be able to say no to me, even though I have more power than you in this moment? And then we take a lot of time to talk about that. And like, what would it mean for you to say no to me? Because I have more power. And I think if you look at rape is about someone saying no, not giving consent. And then people just, because they have power, just pushing right through your no. So in therapy, we don't want to replicate the very oppressions we're trying to mitigate, right? Or we're trying to resist. So I want to make sure I don't push anybody to anything. I want to enact the resistance against rape culture is creating consent culture. So I need to act a consent culture, right? So then we talk about that. And then the first time the person gives me a face like, I'm not sure about that. I'm like, oh, is that no? And they're like, kind of, can it be? I'm like, yeah, this is exciting. So you've said no to me. Okay. So I got it wrong. And they're like, okay, so now she's doing humility and she's acknowledged, yeah, you did. Like, what are you asking me about that for? I'm like, yeah, why am I asking it? I said, just 27 years of school and arrogance. I don't know. Too many letters behind my name, and they're like, yeah, all you guys start to do this. And then they we're starting to replicate it. That is the path out of rape, not working through all the trauma details of rape, but being able to say no to a person of power and having that acknowledged, so it creates a new territory, right? So what I think about is creating relationships of respect and dignity, where it's our job to build a bridge to the person, meeting them where they're at in the world, which means that we see their behavior as making sense. We don't see it as trauma behavior as a criteria of this, and that they're actually trying to seek safety. They're not trying to dissociate or something. They're actually resisting something. And then, inviting people to responsibility where they have it so they change their relationship with suffering. I mean, if I'm on all of that map is about structuring safety, right? And so, and that there be dragons in most of the work that I do, I always create a solidarity team to try to hold me account to the work that I'm doing. Like Sekna Hamid Beckett was on my solidarity team for the work I wrote up with Bauman that we were talking about. As a woman from Muslim culture who's a brown woman, she could really help me when I started to move into white supremacy and just thinking it's okay for me to ask a brown person anything I wanted. I can start to replicate that stuff because white supremacy is the air we breathe, right? And so, and Sekna Hamid Beckett has the moral courage to actually challenge me and ask me. I'd written some sentence that said this was blah, blah, blah. And she said, did he really say that? Is that a word he would use about himself? Or is that a white person's word describing a brown? Because I don't think that he would say that about him. And it was like such a great call to accountability,
Mm-hmm.
you know? So I work, you can't keep yourself accountable. You can't
Yep.
keep your work safe.
Mm-hmm.
So I work a lot with real structures of accountability for communal accountabilities to
Mm-hmm.
people, and
Mm-hmm.
creating solidarity teams where I know people have, where I make my work public.
Mm-hmm.
Harleen Anderson, who I adore from Collaborative Therapies, she was part of my PhD work. She wasn't on my committee, or I would have been a better paper if she had been a part of that. But she talks about the difference between transparency and making public. Transparency is the client's duty to see. You can say it's all transparent.
Mm-hmm.
But making public, it's my duty to show.
Mm-hmm.
And that really landed me. I mean, Janella Bird talks about language that sings, talk that sings. And when Harleen said that it's my duty to show, that I thought that she's putting language to what I've been trying to do with survivors of torture, which is I am trying to show my trustworthiness. I am trying to show my accountability.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I need to do things to make all of that public. They can't just trust me because I'm stepping into psychology, which has done so much harm and is, you know, like punks say, right? Any tool is a weapon if you hold it right. Psychology is, you know, you can hit somebody over the head with a narrative therapy question, with a motivational interviewing question, with a body oriented question. Like, it's not our theory or practice that deliver ethics, it's our ethics. You know, I believe that you have to have collective accountability to enact those kind of ethics. It's not, again, it's this resistance against individualism, right? Yeah.
Wow. So I'm aware of the time. This is wonderful, and I think we've got enough to make people want to read this article.
Okay, good. Oh, good.
You're really, really, really impressive. So thank you so much. I love your energy and your commitment.
Oh, thanks. No, I'm really humbled to be part of this, and I just should front load actually that it's very collaborative. Everything I'm bringing, I've been taught by people and movements. This isn't about, you know, one person. So I really appreciate it. I'm super excited to be part of this journal and to read the rest of everybody else's writing. Thanks.
Thank you. Take care. Stay safe.